Claire Miller, Chief Executive Officer of the New South Wales Irrigators Council. Great to have you back on Flow again.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me on, Rikki.
Well, you've released a really intriguing policy statement and using the evocative image of a black box that you want to unlock when it comes to water allocation. What are you on about there?
So what we've had, obviously we've had climate change having its effect since 2000. So there's been a step change with inflows right across the whole basin, almost halving. So obviously, less water will translate into lower water allocations. Irrigators are the last to be allocated water after towns, stock and domestic, and rivers. So inevitably with climate change and a warming, drying trend, you're going to have less water to allocate. But what we sort of see when we examine this is there's also been a number of policy decisions and river operational decisions that have been made over the last 20 years as well. And each of these also has a bearing on how much water is left over and available for allocation against these licences, which are held by the irrigators and also by the environment now. The environment, for example, owns about a third of general security entitlements in the Murray River. So, this issue of eroding reliability of entitlements is as pertinent for the environment because it's less water allocated to those licences.
Yeah, I think some people have unkindly described the environmental water holder as the biggest water baron in the basin in terms of size of ownership.
Well, they certainly do own the most water. They own 28% of the entitlements that were either used by irrigators or used to support irrigation in the past. Most of that has been acquired under the Basin plan, but there was also entitlement acquired under the Living Murray projects and also the water for rivers, for the Snowy River, and additional water for South Australia. And those predate the Basin plan. So yes, the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder is the largest water owner in the basin.
Yeah, the biggest fish in the river in that sense. But when you look at the storages, there's talk Menindee Lakes will fill. Hume Dam, we've just talked recently with the acting Chief Executive Andrew Reynolds about them releasing water because that's going to fill. But why aren't general security allocations going up at the same time?
And that's the counterintuitive thing, isn't it? Surely if all of the dams, all of the reservoirs and storages that support allocation against entitlements in the southern basin, they're all full to spilling. Why is it that general security in particular, and to a lesser degree high security in Victoria, why is it stuck so low? Why are they so slow to rise? And as I said, there's a number of policy drivers that kick into here. So one example is a much more conservative approach to reserving water in case it turns dry. So we've got sort of a belts and braces approach. This has evolved out of the experience of the Millennium Drought, which reset the metrics. So basically, they hold back enough water to run the river if that drought of record started tomorrow. It's extremely conservative. There's also a very conservative approach to allowing for losses through the system. We don't have as good a handle on sort of how much water is lost just by running a river. And so, they set aside a very, very generous amount for that. There is also a backup drought reserve that's held up in the Snowy hydro storages as well, in case everything else goes cactus and there's no inflows at all, everything's dry, and then they could keep the River Murray flowing for 1 year.
Can we just pause there for a second? Because I reckon this is bringing an analogy back to mind. Now, a lot of the energy grid was privatised in previous decades, and in the last 15 years there was this accusation that they were gold-plating the grid, and that's why energy prices had got so high, is because they were kind of gold-plating the network. What you're describing here is sort of a gold-plating of the water network.
Yes, it is gold plating it for, it's an extreme risk aversion. And absolutely understand why, because obviously a repeat of the Millennium Drought, it was pretty grim through that time. And so that's reset the metrics, so more water gets set aside for that. So it becomes a question of risk appetite. What's never been done, though, was that under the 2004 National Water Initiative, when policy changes like this were made, they were supposed to each one undergo a regulatory impact statement. So it would be understood what the potential impact could be on, for example, property right, which is the entitlement, which includes entitlement reliability. No state has ever done that, and neither has the Commonwealth. So it may well be if you did all of that analysis and it was like, well, the trade-off here is that, general security reliability is going to shift from 60 to 45%, people would say, well, we're willing to cop that. But it's never, ever been quantified what the impact of these different drivers. And that's just one example, by the way. There's other issues, such as, the way that the market has co-opted carryover. So part of carryover now is a risk mitigation tool to create a quasi-high reliability product. And, that water sits in the dams. That is the highest priority, most secure water there is. So they've got to keep water in the dams to meet that carryover obligation, which of course means that you're displacing inflows, because inflows go to meeting that obligation, and it's only what's left over with the inflows that then kick in for your new season allocation. So when the dams are this full, no one's drawing down on them to create airspace because they're not using the water because they're getting the rain out of the sky at the moment for free.
Yep.
But the result is it does put a brake on new season allocations. So that's another example of another dynamic that's just emerged over the last 10, 15 years in just the way that the water market.
So in effect, like the conversation we've had with the MDBA recently about what they're releasing from Hume Dam, some of what they're leaving allowance for is kind of farmers not saving up for a rainy day, saving up for a dry day.
Yes. Yep, absolutely, exactly. We've got multiple factors in here. There's no one thing, but for us as an organisation, what we look at when we sort of, it all gets divided into pie charts, who has what water, is to look at the parts of that where maybe there's room to move or a different approach could be taken, or the rules could be changed. But the first and foremost thing we want to see is that effectively that analysis being done where they crack open that allocation black box, and instead of just saying, oh, well, we get as much water as the rules allow, which tends to be the default position that we get from the department in New South Wales, the issue here is not that. The issue is we need to actually go through the rules themselves, how they've evolved over the last 20 years, and what has been what impact, if any, are they having on entitlement reliability. And that creates then an informed conversation among water users about what level of risk do you want to take, is there anything you want to change, or all things considered, stay as we are. Now, we can't even have that conversation, and all we have is a lot of people getting very upset and frustrated because all they see is, hang on a sec, it's pouring, it's water everywhere, and my allocation's still 30%. How does that work?
Yeah, and it's a very different scenario for people in South Australia where they're basically high security users that's been locked in some time ago, and they seem to get the first grab at water when it becomes available.
Well, that comes to another one, which it's always very complicated in the Southern Basin because it's all connected with 3 states. So South Australia does get first dibs, and that's under the Murray-Darling Agreement. That agreement in different forms has been there for about 100 years. The current one, in its most substantive parts, dates back to about 1973. So that's when it was agreed that South Australia would get at least 1850 gigalitres over the border every year, except under exceptional drought circumstances. So when Victoria, the water is divvied up between Victoria and New South Wales and Dartmouth and Hume, the first thing is they both equally have to commit enough of that water to meet that annual minimum over the border to South Australia. And then whatever's left over is what they divvy up among their water users.
Yeah, but that 1850 is not exclusively for environmental purposes, also to support permanent plantings as well?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. About 696 of it is what they call dilution flows. So that's essentially dates back to when salinity was a particular problem, to dilute, water quality. And the balance, the rest of it is in different ways committed to some environmental purpose, but also, about 500, I'm just trying to remember my numbers off the top of my head. It's a bit over 540 or 500 gigalitres, which is irrigation entitlements. Now, again, about 100 gigalitres of those are now owned by the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder. But yes, that volume is to meet their own.
Yeah, that's the Southern Basin. I want to turn our gaze to the Northern Basin, and one just I wanted to pick up on because ABARES came out with their report today. Just with cotton, they're projecting there'll be increased plantings of cotton this year. Would that be largely in the Murray-Darling Basin or elsewhere as well?
It'll be largely in the Murray-Darling Basin. Now, most cotton is grown up in those northern valleys, but there is a substantial amount of cotton now that's grown in the Murrumbidgee Valley, and also understands it's coming down into the Murray as well. Not surprising that you would have a lot that's planned to be planted because it's wet everywhere. People have got water. Cotton is an annual crop.
Soaking wet in the northern part, the very north part near the Queensland border.
Yep, it just keeps on raining up there, which is great for the Barwon Darling River. All those rivers are flowing really strongly now. And so it's really good for economic sort of returns and economic activity in those northern valleys. And also, of course, it's filling Menindee, which means that Menindee is now, the MDBA has already announced that it will be relying on Menindee to supply water needs to South Australia below Wentworth, basically, 1850. So not the whole 1850, but to basically support South Australia's entitlement and water needs, which takes all the pressure then off that being supplied entirely out of Hume and Dartmouth, which brings us back to the question, so why is the general security still only 30%, given that it's not even, like during droughts and things when rivers stop flowing in the north and Menindee drops down too low, then all that pressure comes back onto the Murray alone.
Yeah.
On that South Australian commitment, as well as their own commitments to Victoria and New South Wales.
Yep, that's the nub of it in the south. In the north, your policy announcement today talks about metering as well. We've talked before about this regulation that's sort of having trouble getting its way through the state parliament in New South Wales. Is that kind of where we're getting at? You've got a great term there of a stroll out, not a roll out when it comes to metering.
It's actually a broader issue on the metering. So so the first thing is all water use across New South Wales is already metered. People already have meters, whether in the Northern Basin or the Southern Basin, and that's metering their general security water use, supplementary access, and so on. The one form of take that's not yet metered is floodplain harvesting, and that is part of the regulations we want to see go through, because that's how you make sure that when it's licensed and the volume that's allowed to be taken is reduced, NRA is able to get out there because it's got to be metered with these special sort of telemetry devices with remote readings and so on that NRA can then enforce compliance. So that is, that's already something we want to happen as part of regulating floodplain harvesting and bringing that form of take into the same framework as everyone else. What we're referring to, though, there in the blueprint is a larger issue. And this concerns every valley across New South Wales, whether in the basin, in the Murray-Darling Basin or on the coast. Following the Four Corners Pumped program in 2017, which raised issues about compliance and compliance activities by government, part of the response to that was to set a new standard for metering. So everyone's already got meters that are pretty accurate, but the government decided, no, we're going to introduce a new gold standard here. And this is a gold standard that no other state has to comply. The irrigators don't have to comply, water users don't have to comply with it. And in fact, it's the highest in the world. So currently, we've got this sort of phased through thing where all water users must replace their current meters with a meter that can meet the new standard, so it's much more accurate, or prove that their existing meter can meet that standard. And this is rolling out. But unfortunately, so we've got the big irrigators needed to be sort of compliant with this. This is, the ones over 500 millimetres, the big guys, right across the state, needed to be compliant by the 1st of December last year. Then we've got about another 7,500 works, so about 3,000 to 4,000 water users. With smaller pumps in the northern inland valleys, they need to be compliant. Like if I've done this replacement by the 1st of December this year, then it moves down to the southern inland valleys by 1st of December next year, and then coastal a year after that. What we've encountered with the rollout, though, with the first tranche, and now we're sort of coming to crunch time for this second group, there's a whole lot of barriers in the way. Things that are outside the water users' control that mean that it's difficult for them to comply. And these are things that are outside their control. They're all related to the administrative and technical barriers and technical things that Water New South Wales and the department, it's their job to fix this. We can't do it. We can tell people you must be able to demonstrate you have made every reasonable effort to comply. You must have put your order in for the meter. You must have engaged a duly qualified person. Don't leave it till the last minute to do this, because all of you piling onto websites and things at once isn't going to cut it, but also NRA doesn't take a very dim view of it if you leave it till the last minute. But nonetheless, the market can't supply demand. There's not enough of these duly qualified people to go around to actually do the installations and validation.
And I imagine their movement around New South Wales is somewhat restricted at the moment as well.
Well, that's compounding the problem. And these devices need to, what they call telemetry. There's mobile black spots all over rural and regional and remote New South Wales, so people can't get them to actually connect so they can read because they're in mobile black spots. Now, obviously, no farmer can be held responsible for the fact that there's very poor telecommunications infrastructure. And the department's sort of saying, oh, yeah, well, we're developing a satellite option. And it's like, yeah, well, when is that going to be available? What's the cost going to be? And in the meantime, NRA will mark people down as being non-compliant.
And farmers are investing in meters that may end up being redundant by the sounds of that.
Well, they're being asked to spend a lot of money, and then they could well get letters from NRA saying you're not compliant due to problems beyond their control. Another one that really bothers me is that in the first group, the big guys, you had about 1,126 works. Right, so obviously, most people own, a couple of metres or 3 metres or so it's a fewer number of people. But anyway, you had 1,100 works. When NRA went to do on-site inspections for every single one of them, they could not find about a third of those because they had, the register, presumably Water New South Wales database, had the wrong addresses or didn't have the right contact numbers or emails, so they couldn't actually find the owners or find the works themselves, a third of them. So translate that to the next tranche, 7,500 works, and then the next one after that in the southern inland valleys. I would have thought the very basic thing of compliance and an orderly rollout of a reform of this nature, when all the expense is being borne by irrigators, and there is some financial assistance, the very basic thing is you'd actually know where all the works are, wouldn't you, and who owns them?
Yeah, if you've told farmers they need to have a 3-metre high fence around their properties, but you haven't got the resources to get out to actually find where the fencing's been done, it ends up being a bit of a farce.
Well, NRA actually does have the resources to go out and find where the fencing is being done, but they can't find out where they're supposed to go.
So are these matters being raised with you're raising these with the New South Wales Water Minister? Are you making any progress on that front?
We've just completed a very comprehensive report where we sort of decided to stop going with just anecdotal information and feeding that in. So we've compiled it all into a single report, which we released last week. It's on our website if anyone would like to read that. It's a bit like whack-a-mole. We've just get new issues emerging. So we've had another couple emerge since the report was finished that we're now sort of trying to deal with. And so, we released that last week, and we're now sort of seeking meetings with the heads of the Department, Water New South Wales, Irrigation Australia Limited, and NRA to say, okay, what are we going to do here? We do everything we can to tell our members to, what they need to do. We put it in all our newsletters. Our member organisations do the same. We know that Water New South Wales says that it's, sent letters and phoned people, but as I say, given that NRA couldn't actually find a third of the owners in the first tranche, I'm not sure they've managed to reach out to everyone. But, so as I say, if people are sitting on their hands out there and not making every effort to comply, we're not going to have a lot of sympathy for that. But if they are making every effort to comply and can demonstrate that and are still being pinged for non-compliance or warned about non-compliance due to these factors I've gone through outside their control, that's not fair. That's in the government's remit. We've warned of these problems for years, and it's just got to be fixed. I hate to think that we're still, rumbling into next year as we move into the southern inland areas. And a lot of these problems are still not being solved because it just gets worse and worse and worse. And in the end, what we end up with is headlines saying water users aren't compliant with metering requirements, which makes it sound like they're not metered, which is rubbish. They are already metered. They're just being asked to comply with a higher standard. And secondly, that water users are doing the wrong thing when the vast majority are absolutely doing the right thing. But there's barriers outside their control.
And that's a critical point you raise, is that in the end, the headlines, people will try and do a disservice to the debate when it comes to water by making it sound simplistic, but there's a lot of complexity, as you've gone into in our lengthy chat you've had with us today. So much appreciate that breakdown, and there's a whole lot more in that policy document about what you're seeking in the water blueprint. Where can people get that online if they want to look into it further?
If they just hop onto our website, they'll be able to read it on there, and they're of course welcome to send us an email and we can email one back.
Well, Claire Miller, CEO of New South Wales Irrigators Council, thanks for spending your time with us today. Much appreciated.
Very welcome. Thanks very much, Rikki.